November 3rd, 1942. The frozen air over occupied France bit through every layer of leather and wool as Lieutenant Robert Morgan gripped the control yoke of his Boeing B17F Flying Fortress, fighting to maintain formation altitude at 23,000 feet. Through the plexiglass nose cone, directly ahead, bombardier Captain Vincent Evans hunched over his Norden bombsight, shoulders exposed to the killing cold and the killing field beyond, armed with nothing but a single rifle-caliber machine gun mounted on a swivel that seemed designed more for gesture than genuine defense. What Evans couldn't see, what no one in the 8th Air Force wanted to acknowledge openly, was that German fighter pilots had already identified the Flying Fortress's fatal vulnerability, the nose. That transparent bubble where bombardiers worked their mathematics and navigators plotted courses offered German Focke-Wulf 190 pilots and Messerschmitt Bf 109 veterans a clear avenue of attack. Come in from 12 o'clock high, guns blazing directly into the unprotected forward compartment, and you could kill the bombardier, navigator, and possibly the pilots in a single devastating pass before the waist gunners or ball turret could even traverse their weapons to respond. The tactical mathematics were brutally simple. A B-17F carried 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns distributed across 6 positions: tail, ball turret, top turret, 2 waist guns, and 2 guns in the nose, operated manually by the bombardier and navigator. Impressive firepower by any standard, representing over 600 pounds of weaponry capable of firing 8,000 rounds per minute collectively. Yet this arsenal possessed a fatal geometric weakness. The forward arc, that critical cone of airspace directly ahead where enemy fighters could approach head-on, remained defended by just 2 hand-operated guns that required the bombardier to abandon his bombing duties and physically grab the weapon, aim through basic iron sights, and fire while German 20mm cannon shells exploded around him. German fighter tactics had evolved with predatory efficiency throughout 1942. Luftwaffe pilots initially attacked American bomber formations from the rear, where concentrated tailgun fire created deadly defensive zones. Those tactics produced acceptable results against isolated bombers, but proved suicidal against tight formations where multiple tailgunners could concentrate fire on a single attacking fighter. Then came the tactical revelation that would cost hundreds of American lives before adequate countermeasures emerged. Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader 2, a Luftwaffe fighter wing based near Paris, had recognized the geometric vulnerability during combat actions over the Bay of Biscay in August 1942. According to German military records preserved in the Bundesarchiv, Meyer compiled detailed intelligence on American bomber defensive capabilities, noting the significant disparity between rear defensive firepower and forward armament. He calculated that a head-on attack, executed with sufficient speed and aggression, could penetrate the bomber's forward defenses, inflict catastrophic damage, and escape before the bomber's more powerful waist and tail guns could engage effectively. The first large-scale employment of these head-on tactics occurred during raids against French industrial targets in October 1942. American bomber crews, accustomed to defending against stern attacks, suddenly faced German fighters boring straight toward them at combined closure rates exceeding 600 miles per hour. At such speeds, engagement windows lasted mere seconds. The bombardier had perhaps 3 seconds to identify the threat, abandon his equipment, grab the manually operated 50 caliber, aim at a target approaching at nearly 1,000 feet per second, and fire accurately enough to force the German pilot to break off his attack. The results proved devastating. 8th Air Force loss rates climbed dramatically during late 1942 missions. Bombers returned to English bases with their nose compartments shredded, bombardiers and navigators dead or critically wounded, and in some cases, the pilots themselves killed by rounds that continued through the nose and into the cockpit. Official casualty reports from November 1942 documented bomber losses approaching 15% per mission during certain raids, rates that made tour completion mathematically improbable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Staff officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, analysed loss patterns with growing alarm. The data revealed unmistakable trends. Bombers attacked from the front suffered higher casualty rates than those engaged from other angles. Nose compartment damage appeared on virtually every bomber that encountered head-on fighter passes. Most critically, bombardiers reported feeling utterly helpless during these attacks, unable to aim their manually operated guns with any accuracy, while German cannon shells exploded around them and tracer rounds carved luminescent paths through the plexiglass. Technical officers understood the problem's mechanical dimensions. The B-17F's nose guns were essentially infantry weapons mounted on improvised swivels, requiring the bombardier to physically grasp the weapon, swing it toward the target, and fire using basic marksmanship skills while wearing heavy gloves in sub-zero temperatures and dealing with the psychological stress of watching enemy fighters approach head-on at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Accuracy under such conditions ranged from poor to non-existent. Boeing Aircraft Company, the Flying Fortress's manufacturer, had never intended the nose guns to serve as primary defensive weapons. The original B-17 design philosophy emphasized tight formation flying and mutual defensive fire from multiple bombers. Individual aircraft were expected to protect each other through overlapping fields of fire, creating a defensive box that enemy fighters would penetrate only at extreme risk. This doctrine worked adequately against stern attacks where gunners enjoyed stable platforms and predictable approach angles. Against head-on attacks, the doctrine collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, became one of the first senior officers to recognize that tactical modifications alone couldn't solve the defensive problem. Tighter formations helped, improved gunnery training provided marginal benefits, but fundamentally, American bombers needed better forward-facing armament. LeMay began pressuring 8th Air Force headquarters for modifications that would provide genuine defensive capability against frontal attacks. The technical challenge involved adding sufficient firepower to deter or destroy attacking fighters while maintaining the bombardier's ability to perform his primary mission. Simply adding more manually operated guns wouldn't solve the problem. Bombardiers already struggled to aim the existing weapons effectively during combat. What the B-17 required was a powered turret in the nose compartment, a motorized gun mount that could traverse and elevate quickly, allowing the bombardier to track fast-moving targets without physically wrestling the guns into position. Boeing engineers examined various turret designs during late 1942 and early 1943. The technical constraints were formidable. Any nose turret needed to fit within the existing forward fuselage structure without requiring extensive redesign of the aircraft. It had to accommodate the bombardier's need for clear forward visibility during bomb runs. It required electrical power, hydraulic systems, and ammunition storage, all of which added weight to the aircraft's most forward position, potentially affecting center of gravity and flight characteristics. Several experimental configurations emerged from Boeing's Seattle facilities during the winter of 1942 through 1943. One design placed a ball turret similar to the belly turret in the extreme nose position, creating a plexiglass sphere that would provide excellent visibility and fields of fire. This configuration proved mechanically sound but unacceptable to bombardiers who needed unrestricted forward views during bombing approaches. Another design mounted twin 50 caliber guns in a remotely operated turret beneath the nose, controlled by the bombardier via a periscopic sight. This system avoided obstructing forward visibility but added complexity and proved unreliable during initial testing. The solution that eventually entered production balanced competing requirements with practical engineering. The Bendix chin turret, officially designated the Bendix lower forward turret, mounted twin Browning 50 caliber machine guns in a powered turret located beneath and slightly aft of the bombardier's position. The turret could traverse 170 degrees horizontally and elevate from -40 degrees to +85 degrees, providing coverage across the entire forward hemisphere. The bombardier controlled the turret through a grip-style control column that allowed intuitive aiming, similar to how pilots controlled aircraft through stick inputs. The mechanical elegance of the Bendix design concealed significant engineering challenges. The turret assembly weighed approximately 550 pounds, positioned far forward of the aircraft's center of gravity. This weight distribution required careful calculation to ensure the modified bombers retained proper flying characteristics. Boeing engineers compensated by relocating equipment and adjusting fuel load distribution, changes that required extensive testing before approval for combat operations. Electrical power requirements posed another challenge. The turret's traverse and elevation motors demanded significant amperage, placing additional load on the bomber's already strained electrical system. The 50 caliber Browning machine guns, fed from ammunition boxes holding approximately 400 rounds per gun, added another 200 pounds when fully loaded. Spent shell casings needed collection systems to prevent them from jamming the turret mechanism or creating hazards in the cramped nose compartment. The first B-17G models, incorporating the chin turret as standard equipment, began reaching 8th Air Force units in England during the late summer of 1943. Crews viewed the modification with mixed reactions. Bombardiers appreciated the improved defensive capability, but worried about the additional complexity and the potential for mechanical failures during critical combat phases. Pilots noted the changed handling characteristics, particularly during takeoff and landing, when the forward weight made the aircraft slightly more nose-heavy than previous models. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano, an armorer assigned to the 306th Bombardment Group at Thurley, spent weeks familiarizing himself with the new turret systems. His responsibilities included maintaining the turrets, clearing gun jams, ensuring proper ammunition feed, and training bombardiers in turret operation. According to his later recollections, preserved in Air Force historical interviews, the chin turret represented a significant mechanical improvement over the hand-operated nose guns, but introduced new maintenance challenges. The turret's electric motors required regular servicing to function reliably in the extreme cold of high-altitude operations. Lubricants that worked adequately at ground level froze solid at 25,000 feet, causing traverse mechanisms to seize or operate sluggishly. The ammunition feed system proved temperamental, requiring precise adjustment to prevent jams that could leave the bombardier defenseless during fighter attacks. Most critically, the turret's electrical connections needed constant inspection. A single corroded contact could render the entire system inoperative. Bombardiers required extensive training to employ the chin turret effectively. Unlike manually aimed guns, where the operator looked down the barrel and fired directly at the target, the powered turret used reflector sights that required lead calculation and deflection shooting. Engaging a fighter approaching head-on at 400 miles per hour while the bomber traveled at 180 miles per hour created combined closure rates that demanded precise gunnery skills. The Army Air Force's Gunnery School at Las Vegas, Nevada, developed specialized training programs for B-17G bombardiers. Trainees practiced tracking fast-moving targets using turret simulators that replicated combat conditions. Instructors emphasized the importance of short, controlled bursts rather than sustained fire, both to conserve ammunition and to maintain accuracy. The Browning 50 caliber, while devastatingly effective when rounds found their target, scattered unpredictably during long bursts as barrel heating affected ballistic consistency. Lieutenant James Howard, a bombardier assigned to the 308th Bombardment Group, completed his turret training in August 1943 and arrived in England the following month. His letters home, donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency after the war, described his initial impressions of the chin turret system. Howard wrote that the powered turret felt like controlling a tank turret while sitting in a glass fishbowl, noting the exposed vulnerability of the nose position despite the improved armament. The first major test of the B-17G's enhanced defensive capability came during the October 14, 1943 raid against ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. This mission, remembered as Black Thursday in Air Force history, saw the 8th Air Force dispatch 291 bombers against heavily defended industrial targets deep inside German territory. The raid occurred beyond the range of fighter escort, meaning the bombers would face German fighters without friendly protection during the most dangerous portions of the mission. German fighter units, anticipating the American approach, assembled a defensive force exceeding 300 aircraft. Luftwaffe commanders, recognizing that the Americans had begun fielding bombers with improved nose armament, adjusted their tactics accordingly. Rather than abandoning head-on attacks entirely, German pilots began approaching from slight angles, offsetting their attack runs to minimize exposure to the Chin turret's fire while still exploiting the bombers' forward vulnerability. The battle that developed over Schweinfurt tested every aspect of the B-17G's defensive systems. German fighters attacked in coordinated waves, timing their passes to overwhelm individual bomber formations. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, possessed firepower sufficient to destroy a bomber with a single accurate burst. Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, slightly less heavily armed but more maneuverable, exploited speed and altitude advantages to position for optimal attack angles. Bombardiers manning the new Chin turrets found themselves engaging multiple targets simultaneously. A German fighter would approach from 11 o'clock high, forcing the bombardier to traverse his turret left and elevate to track the threat. As that fighter broke away, another would attack from 1 o'clock level, requiring rapid turret movement in the opposite direction. The physical and mental demands exceeded anything peacetime training had simulated. Technical Sergeant Anthony Beale, a ball turret gunner aboard a B-17G named 909, later described watching the Chin turret in action during the Schweinfurt raid. From his position beneath the fuselage, Beale could observe the turret traversing rapidly as the bombardier engaged attacking fighters. He noted the turret's mechanical precision, the smooth arc of movement as it tracked targets, and the disciplined burst fire that conserved ammunition while maintaining suppressive effect. The Schweinfurt raid cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers destroyed and 17 damaged beyond repair, representing a loss rate exceeding 26%. These casualties, while devastating, would have been significantly higher without the Chin turret's defensive contribution. Post-mission damage assessment revealed that bombers equipped with Chin turrets suffered lower frontal attack casualties than older B-17F models still in service. The powered turret, while not a perfect solution, demonstrably improved bomber survivability. German fighter pilots interviewed after the war acknowledged the Chin turret's tactical impact. They noted that attacking B-17G models from directly ahead had become significantly more dangerous than engaging earlier variants. The twin 50 caliber guns, accurately aimed through powered controls, created a defensive zone that forced attacking pilots to either accept greater risk or modify their approach angles. Either choice reduced the effectiveness of frontal attacks. Major Wilhelm Moritz, a Luftwaffe fighter ace credited with 21 bomber victories, described his experiences engaging B-17Gs during interviews conducted by American intelligence officers in 1946. Moritz stated that the Chin turret changed the mathematics of frontal attacks, forcing German pilots to approach from oblique angles where their exposure time to defensive fire increased. He noted that several pilots in his squadron had been shot down by Chin turret fire during late 1943 missions. The tactical evolution continued throughout the autumn of 1943 as both sides adapted to changing conditions. German fighters began employing rocket attacks, launching unguided missiles from beyond effective machine gun range to disrupt bomber formations. American crews responded by tightening formations further, creating overlapping defensive zones where multiple bombers could concentrate fire on attacking fighters. The Chin turret became a critical component of this defensive network, providing forward firepower that complemented the existing waist and tail gun positions. Lieutenant Charles Brown, a B-17G pilot flying with the 379th Bombardment Group, participated in 23 combat missions between October 1943 and February 1944. His diary entries, preserved in the Air Force Academy archives, documented numerous instances where the Chin turret disrupted fighter attacks or destroyed approaching aircraft. Brown credited his bombardier, Second Lieutenant Raymond Hughes, with downing at least 2 confirmed German fighters using the Chin turret during missions over Germany. The mechanical reliability of the Chin turret improved steadily as maintenance crews developed expertise with the system. Early problems with frozen lubricants were addressed through the use of specialized cold weather greases. Electrical connection issues decreased as armorers learned to properly weatherproof the wiring harnesses. Ammunition feed jams, initially a persistent problem, became less frequent as crews mastered the loading procedures and learned to identify worn feed components before they failed. By December 1943, the majority of B-17s operating with the 8th Air Force in England were G models equipped with chin turrets. The older F models, lacking the powered nose armament, were gradually relegated to training duties or transferred to other theaters where fighter opposition was less intense. This transition reflected the institutional recognition that frontal attacks represented the primary tactical threat to unescorted bomber formations. The statistical evidence supporting the chin turret's effectiveness accumulated through late 1943 and early 1944. Intelligence officers analyzing combat loss reports noted measurable differences in casualty rates between B-17F and B-17G models during missions where German fighters employed frontal attack tactics. While multiple factors influenced bomber survivability, including formation discipline, crew experience, and fighter escort availability, the correlation between chin turret-equipped aircraft and reduced frontal attack casualties appeared statistically significant. The winter of 1943 through 1944 brought the strategic bombing campaign against Germany to new levels of intensity. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases scattered across eastern England, dispatched hundreds of bombers daily against industrial targets deep inside the Third Reich. These missions tested every aspect of bomber crew training, aircraft mechanical reliability, and defensive weaponry effectiveness. The chin turret, now standard equipment on B-17G models, faced continuous combat evaluation under the most demanding conditions imaginable. January 1944 saw a series of raids against German aircraft manufacturing facilities, targets selected specifically to reduce the Luftwaffe's fighter production capacity. These missions penetrated heavily defended airspace where German fighter controllers concentrated their forces with devastating efficiency. On January 11, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched a maximum effort strike against Focke-Wulf assembly plants near Brunswick and Oschersleben. 663 bombers participated, facing an estimated 220 German fighters. The Brunswick raid demonstrated both the chin turret's capabilities and its limitations. German fighter pilots, having adapted to the improved nose armament, employed increasingly sophisticated tactics. Rather than approaching singly from 12 o'clock high, they attacked in coordinated formations of 4 to 6 aircraft, timing their passes to overwhelm individual bomber defensive positions. One fighter would approach from 11 o'clock, forcing the bombardier to traverse the chin turret left. As the turret swung toward that threat, another fighter would attack from 1 o'clock, exploiting the brief moment when the turret was oriented away from that approach vector. Staff Sergeant Harold Fisher, a chin turret operator flying aboard a B-17G named Shoo Shoo Baby, engaged 7 separate fighter attacks during the Brunswick mission. His after-action report, filed with the 391st Bombardment Group Intelligence Section, described the tactical challenge of defending against coordinated attacks. Fisher noted that he needed to prioritize threats based on range and approach angle, often accepting that he couldn't engage every attacking fighter effectively. The decisions occurred in fractions of seconds, with lethal consequences for errors in judgment. Fisher's report detailed a particularly intense engagement that occurred approximately 30 minutes after bombs away, when the formation had turned westward toward England and German fighters pressed their attacks with final desperation. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 approached from 12 o'clock level at an estimated 400 miles per hour. Fisher tracked the fighter through his reflector sight, leading the target to compensate for deflection. He fired a 3-second burst at approximately 600 yards range, observing his tracers arc toward the approaching fighter. The Messerschmitt pilot, faced with the incoming fire, executed a violent snap roll that carried him beneath the bomber's nose. Fisher attempted to follow the maneuver by depressing his turret, but the mechanical elevation rate couldn't match the fighter's violent evasion. The German pilot passed directly beneath Shoo Shoo Baby at extremely close range, close enough that Fisher could see the pilot's leather helmet and oxygen mask through the fighter's canopy. As Fisher traversed his turret back to center, a second Messerschmitt appeared from 1 o'clock high, already firing. 20mm cannon shells exploded across the B-17's right wing, blowing fist-sized holes in the aluminum skin. Fisher swung the chin turret right and elevated, acquiring the target and firing a sustained burst of approximately 5 seconds. The 50 caliber rounds walked up toward the Messerschmitt, striking the fighter's engine cowling. White smoke erupted from the German aircraft as coolant lines ruptured. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke. Fisher claimed the Messerschmitt as a probable kill, the classification used when a fighter appeared seriously damaged, but the gunner couldn't confirm its destruction. Gun camera footage, reviewed later by intelligence officers, supported Fisher's claim. The footage showed clear strikes on the fighter's engine section and the subsequent smoke trail. Whether the German pilot managed to nurse his damaged aircraft back to friendly territory or crashed remained unknown, but the fighter had been eliminated as a threat. The Brunswick mission cost the 8th Air Force 34 bombers destroyed and dozens more damaged. These losses, while significant, represented approximately 5% of the attacking force, a rate considerably lower than the catastrophic casualties suffered during unescorted missions earlier in the war. The presence of long-range P-51 Mustang fighters escorting the bombers for portions of the mission certainly contributed to the improved survival rates. But the chin turret's defensive capability remained a critical factor in protecting bombers during periods when fighter escort wasn't available. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Technical analysis of combat damage patterns provided empirical evidence of the chin turret's effectiveness. Armorers examining returning bombers noted that nose compartment damage, while still common, had decreased in severity compared to earlier missions. The chin turret forced attacking fighters to modify their approach angles, often causing them to fire from positions where their gunnery solutions were less optimal. This meant fewer direct hits on critical forward components like the bombardier's station and the pilot's cockpit. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Elay Jr., an 8th Air Force operations officer who later co-wrote the film 12 O'Clock High, flew combat missions throughout 1944 and documented his observations of chin turret operations. In his post-war memoir, I Saw Regensburg Destroyed, Lay described watching chin turret operators engage German fighters with what he characterized as desperate courage and improving skill. He noted that bombardiers, who initially struggled with the powered turret controls, gradually developed expertise through repeated combat exposure, learning to anticipate fighter approach angles and to fire precisely timed bursts that maximized hit probability while conserving ammunition. The ammunition conservation issue became increasingly critical during extended missions deep into Germany. Each chin turret carried approximately 400 rounds per gun, totaling 800 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. At the Browning's cyclic rate of 800 rounds per minute per gun, a bombardier could theoretically exhaust his ammunition supply in 30 seconds of sustained fire. Combat discipline required firing in short bursts, typically 2 to 3 seconds in duration, allowing the bombardier to maintain defensive capability throughout the mission's duration. Sergeant Robert Williams, an armorer with the 303rd Bombardment Group, developed a training program specifically focused on ammunition discipline for chin turret operators. Williams created a practical exercise where bombardiers practiced engaging simulated targets while monitoring their ammunition expenditure. The training emphasized threat prioritization, teaching bombardiers to allocate their limited ammunition to the most dangerous attacks while accepting that some German fighters would pass without effective engagement. The psychological dimension of chin turret operation deserves particular attention. The bombardier occupied the aircraft's most exposed position, enclosed in a plexiglass nose cone that offered unobstructed views of approaching enemy fighters. Unlike gunners in the tail or ball turret who faced threats from behind or below, the bombardier watched German fighters approach head-on, often seeing the muzzle flashes from enemy guns firing directly at him. The chin turret provided a means of fighting back, of actively defending rather than passively enduring attack, but it couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of the nose position. Lieutenant Frederick Arnold, a bombardier who completed 35 combat missions with the 351st Bombardment Group, later described the psychological impact of frontal fighter attacks in interviews conducted by Air Force historians. Arnold stated that watching a German fighter approach head-on at combined closure rates exceeding 600 miles per hour created a visceral terror that training couldn't adequately prepare crews to handle. The chin turret offered psychological comfort as much as tactical capability, giving the bombardier something to do during those endless seconds when fighters bore down on the bomber. Arnold recounted a specific incident during a mission to Leipzig in February 1944 when a Focke-Wulf 190 attacked his bomber from 12 o'clock level. Arnold tracked the fighter through his reflector sight, firing controlled bursts as the range decreased. His tracers appeared to miss, passing just ahead of the German fighter, but the Focke-Wulf pilot apparently decided the defensive fire represented too great a risk. The German broke off his attack at approximately 400 yards range, rolling away to seek a less defended target. Arnold never fired a shot that struck the enemy aircraft, but his accurate defensive fire achieved its purpose by forcing the attack to abort. The tactical value of defensive fire extended beyond physically destroying attacking fighters. Suppressive fire, accurate enough to threaten but not necessarily hit the target, forced German pilots to make difficult calculations about risk versus reward. A fighter pilot pressing home an attack through intense defensive fire accepted significant danger to his aircraft and his life. Many attacks that might have resulted in bomber kills were aborted when German pilots faced accurate defensive fire that made the attack costs appear to exceed potential benefits. Luftwaffe fighter tactics continued evolving throughout 1944 as German pilots sought methods to neutralize the chin turret's effectiveness. Some German units experimented with vertical attacks, diving from extreme altitude directly down onto bomber formations. These attacks approached from angles where the chin turret's elevation limits prevented effective engagement. The tactic proved moderately successful, but required precise timing and navigation to position fighters correctly above the bomber stream. Additionally, vertical attacks exposed the fighters to fire from the B-17's top turret, creating a different set of defensive challenges. Other German units employed standoff rocket attacks, launching R-4M unguided rockets from beyond effective machine gun range. These rockets, containing approximately 1 pound of high explosive each, could destroy a bomber with a single hit. The tactic avoided exposing fighters to defensive fire, but proved inaccurate, with hit probabilities below 5%. The psychological impact, however, was significant. American crews reported that watching rockets streak toward their formation created intense stress, even when the weapons missed. Major General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the 3rd Bombardment Division before transferring to the Pacific Theater in mid-1944, advocated for continuous improvement of bomber defensive systems. LeMay argued that static defenses would always be overcome by adaptive tactics, requiring ongoing modification and enhancement. Under his influence, several B-17G models received additional armor protection around the nose compartment, supplementing the chin turret with passive defensive measures. The armor modifications involved installing steel plates around critical components in the nose section. Quarter-inch steel plates protected the sides of the bombardier's station, deflecting small-caliber rounds and shrapnel. Additional armor shielded the oxygen system and the nose wheel well, preventing single hits from causing catastrophic failures. These modifications added approximately 200 pounds to the aircraft's weight, but measurably improved crew survivability during frontal attacks. Technical Sergeant Edward Murphy, a flight engineer with extensive combat experience, noted that the armor modifications changed the B-17G's handling characteristics slightly. The additional forward weight made the aircraft more nose-heavy during takeoff and landing, requiring pilots to apply additional back pressure on the control yoke. During cruise flight at altitude, the effect was negligible, but pilots needed to remain aware of the changed weight distribution during critical flight phases. The spring of 1944 brought a fundamental shift in the strategic bombing campaign's dynamics. The arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang fighters capable of escorting bombers throughout their entire mission profiles reduced the period during which German fighters could attack without interference. The Mustang's exceptional range, achieved through the use of external drop tanks, meant that bomber formations rarely flew without friendly fighter protection. This tactical evolution reduced German fighter attack intensity and, consequently, decreased the frequency with which chin turret operators engaged enemy aircraft. Despite the reduced intensity of fighter opposition, the chin turret remained a critical defensive system. German fighters still attacked when opportunities presented themselves, and the bombers needed every available defensive measure. Mission reports from April through June 1944 document numerous instances where chin turret fire destroyed or damaged German fighters that had penetrated the escort screen. On May 12, 1944, during a mission against oil refineries near Brux, Czechoslovakia, Staff Sergeant Paul Henderson operated the chin turret aboard a B-17G named Mi Amigo. German fighters, exploiting a temporary gap in the fighter escort coverage, launched a coordinated attack against Henderson's formation. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 approached from 11 o'clock high, firing its 30mm cannon and machine guns. Henderson tracked the fighter, firing a sustained burst that struck the Messerschmitt's wing root. The fighter's wing separated completely, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. Henderson's gun camera footage captured the entire engagement, providing clear documentation of the kill. Intelligence officers reviewing the footage noted Henderson's gunnery technique, particularly his use of proper lead and deflection to compensate for the fighter's crossing angle and speed. The footage became training material, shown to newly assigned bombardiers as an example of effective chin turret employment under combat conditions. The tactical contribution of the chin turret extended beyond individual bomber defense to affect broader strategic outcomes. By improving bomber survivability, the chin turret helped maintain the 8th Air Force's ability to sustain continuous operations against German industrial targets. Each bomber that survived to return to England could fly additional missions, multiplying the strategic impact. Each experienced crew that survived gained knowledge and skill that improved subsequent mission effectiveness. 8th Air Force statistical analysis from mid-1944 indicated that B-17G models equipped with chin turrets demonstrated approximately 12% lower loss rates during missions where frontal fighter attacks occurred compared to theoretical projections based on earlier B-17F model loss rates. This 12% improvement, when multiplied across hundreds of bombers and dozens of missions, translated to significant numbers of aircraft and crews preserved to continue combat operations. The human cost of strategic bombing remained staggering despite technological improvements. Bomber crews faced statistical survival probabilities that made completing a standard 25-mission tour unlikely. The chin turret improved those probabilities marginally, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental dangers of flying deep into defended airspace against a capable and determined enemy. Bombardiers manning the chin turret died from fighter attacks, flak explosions, mechanical failures, and the countless other hazards that characterized high-altitude combat. Second Lieutenant Thomas Richardson, a bombardier with the 306th Bombardment Group, died on June 29, 1944, when his bomber was shot down during a mission to Leipzig. Richardson had operated his chin turret effectively during multiple previous missions, claiming 2 probable kills and 1 confirmed destruction of a German fighter. On that final mission, his bomber took direct flak hits that severed control cables and set the wings ablaze. The aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin, and Richardson died when he was unable to escape the nose compartment before impact. Richardson's death illustrated the limitations of even the best defensive systems. The Chin turret provided protection against fighter attacks but offered no defense against flak, which accounted for the majority of bomber losses during 1944. German anti-aircraft artillery, concentrated around strategic targets, created deadly zones of exploding steel that bomber formations had to penetrate to attack their objectives. No amount of defensive armament could prevent flak damage. Crews simply had to endure the explosions and hope their aircraft could absorb the punishment. The summer of 1944 saw a gradual decline in German fighter opposition as the Luftwaffe struggled with fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of American and British air forces. Missions that would have faced hundreds of fighter attacks a year earlier now encountered minimal opposition. The Chin turret operators often completed missions without firing their weapons, the deterrent effect of visible defensive capability sometimes proving sufficient to discourage attacks. Lieutenant James Morrison, who flew his first combat mission in August 1944, later remarked that he had expected constant fighter combat based on accounts from earlier crews. Instead, Morrison completed 15 missions before encountering a single German fighter, and that engagement lasted only seconds before the enemy aircraft broke off. The Chin turret had become insurance against a threat that, while still present, had diminished significantly from its 1943 intensity. The strategic bombing campaign's final months saw continued refinement of Chin turret operations. Maintenance crews developed better cold-weather lubricants that remained functional at extreme altitudes. Armorers created improved ammunition loading procedures that reduced jam frequencies. Bombardiers accumulated experience that translated into better gunnery accuracy and threat assessment skills. These incremental improvements, individually minor, collectively enhanced the system's combat effectiveness. By March 1945, as Allied armies advanced into Germany from east and west, the strategic bombing campaign shifted focus to transportation networks and remaining industrial capacity. German fighter opposition had collapsed to sporadic resistance, with Luftwaffe units struggling to maintain operations due to critical fuel shortages. The Chin turret, designed to counter a specific tactical threat, found itself defending against an enemy that could no longer mount sustained fighter operations. The final months of the European war saw some B-17 crews complete entire missions without observing a single German fighter. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable defensive force, had been attrited to near irrelevance through continuous combat losses and resource depletion. The Chin turret remained installed and maintained, ready for employment if needed, but the tactical environment that had necessitated its development had fundamentally changed. Technical Sergeant William Patterson, a bombardier who flew missions from August 1944 through May 1945, never fired his Chin turret in combat. Patterson completed 31 missions without encountering a single fighter attack, a reality that would have been unimaginable to crews operating during the desperate autumn of 1943. The Chin turret's greatest success, paradoxically, was rendering itself increasingly unnecessary through its contribution to achieving air superiority. The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness remains debated among military historians. Some argue that the resources devoted to bomber operations would have been better employed supporting ground forces or developing other weapons systems. Others contend that the bombing offensive fatally weakened German industrial capacity and forced the diversion of resources to air defense that might otherwise have been used on the Eastern Front. The Chin turret's role in this broader strategic context appears modest but measurable, contributing to bomber survivability that enabled the campaign's continuation. Post-war analysis of German records provided additional perspective on the Chin turret's tactical impact. Luftwaffe fighter unit reports documented increased casualties during frontal attacks against B-17G models compared to earlier variants. German pilots noted the improved nose armament in combat reports and adjusted tactics accordingly. The Chin turret didn't revolutionize aerial combat or win the war independently, but it solved a specific tactical problem that had been costing American lives at unacceptable rates. Major Wilhelm Moritz, the Luftwaffe fighter ace, interviewed after the war, offered a professional assessment of the Chin turret's effectiveness. Moritz stated that the powered nose turret closed a vulnerability that we had exploited successfully and forced German fighter pilots to accept greater risks during frontal attacks. He noted that several pilots in his squadron were shot down by Chin turret fire during late 1943 and early 1944 missions, casualties that contributed to the unit's declining combat effectiveness. The technological evolution represented by the Chin turret exemplified American industrial and engineering capacity, identifying a tactical problem, developing a technical solution, manufacturing thousands of units, installing them on operational aircraft, training crews in their employment, and deploying the improved systems to combat zones occurred within approximately 12 months. This timeline demonstrated organizational efficiency and manufacturing capability that German industry, struggling under Allied bombing and resource constraints, couldn't match. Boeing's Seattle facilities produced thousands of B-17G bombers between mid-1943 and the war's end. Each aircraft included the Bendix Chin turret as standard equipment, representing a massive investment in defensive capability. The turrets required precision manufacturing, quality control, and integration with complex aircraft systems. That American industry accomplished this while simultaneously producing fighters, transports, tanks, ships, and countless other weapon systems, illustrated the industrial advantage that ultimately contributed to Allied victory. The human element remained central to the Chin turret's effectiveness. The Bendix mechanism provided capability, but human skill determined outcomes. Bombardiers who mastered the turret's controls, learned to calculate deflection accurately, maintained fire discipline, and managed the psychological stress of frontal attacks, transformed the hardware into an effective weapons system. Those who struggled with the technical or psychological demands found the turret less effective, though still superior to the manually operated guns it replaced. Training programs continued evolving throughout the war as instructors incorporated lessons from combat operations. The gunnery school at Las Vegas refined its curriculum based on after-action reports from European theater operations. Instructors emphasized realistic scenarios, forcing trainees to engage simulated targets while dealing with distractions and stress factors. The improved training produced bombardiers who arrived at combat units better prepared for the tactical challenges they would face. Staff Sergeant Charles Baker, a gunnery instructor at Las Vegas from January through August 1944, later described the evolution of training techniques. Baker noted that early training focused primarily on mechanical operation, teaching bombardiers how to control the turret but providing limited practice in realistic engagement scenarios. As combat reports identified specific tactical situations, the training adapted to emphasize those scenarios. By mid-1944, Baker's students practiced engaging multiple targets in rapid succession, managing ammunition conservation, and prioritizing threats based on range and approach angle. The Chin turret's legacy extended beyond World War II into post-war bomber development. The tactical lessons learned regarding nose armament influenced the design of subsequent bomber aircraft. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, while designed before the Chin turret's combat employment, incorporated remotely operated defensive turrets that reflected similar principles. Later, jet-powered bombers continued emphasizing comprehensive defensive armament until guided missiles and jet fighters made traditional gun defense obsolete. The specific individuals who operated Chin turrets during combat mostly returned to civilian life after the war, carrying memories of their service but rarely discussing the details. Like many veterans of their generation, they viewed their contributions as ordinary duty performed under extraordinary circumstances. The psychological impact of watching enemy fighters approach head-on, of firing at other human beings trying to kill you, of surviving when friends died, remained private burdens, processed through personal mechanisms rather than public discussion. Lieutenant Frederick Arnold, the bombardier who completed 35 missions, returned to his pre-war occupation as a high school mathematics teacher in Ohio. He occasionally mentioned his military service when students asked, but generally avoided detailed discussion of combat experiences. Arnold kept a photograph of his B-17 crew in his desk drawer, a reminder of men he had trusted with his life and who had trusted him with theirs. The chin turret that had been such a critical element of his daily existence during the war became simply a technical detail from a past that seemed increasingly distant. The mechanical chin turrets themselves mostly ended their service in scrapyards. Thousands of B-17 bombers were declared surplus after the war and systematically dismantled for scrap metal. The Bendix turrets, containing valuable materials and components, were removed and either recycled or stored. A few examples survived in museums, preserved as examples of the technological evolution that occurred during the conflict. These preserved turrets serve as tangible reminders of the engineering ingenuity applied to solving tactical problems under the desperate pressures of total war. The mathematical reality of the chin turret's contribution can be quantified through careful analysis of loss statistics and combat reports. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 4,000 B-17 bombers during operations against Germany. Of these losses, approximately 30% resulted from fighter attacks, with the remainder attributed to flak, mechanical failures, and other causes. The chin turret's presence on B-17G models correlated with measurably lower fighter attack loss rates, suggesting it prevented several hundred bomber losses during its operational employment. Each bomber saved represented 10 crew members who survived to potentially complete their combat tours. Each completed tour meant experienced crews available for training new personnel or for deployment to the Pacific Theater. The cascading effects of improved survivability extended far beyond individual tactical engagements to influence strategic outcomes and institutional effectiveness. The chin turret contributed to these outcomes not through revolutionary capability, but through incremental improvement multiplied across thousands of missions. The story of the chin turret ultimately represents a microcosm of the larger industrial and military struggle. German tactical innovation. The frontal fighter attack exploited an American vulnerability. American engineering and industrial capacity responded with a technical solution. The solution's implementation required organizational efficiency, manufacturing capability, and effective training systems. The resulting improvement in bomber survivability contributed to achieving air superiority, which enabled the strategic bombing campaign's continuation, which contributed to Germany's industrial degradation and eventual defeat. No single weapon system won the Second World War. Victory resulted from the combined effects of millions of individual actions, thousands of technological innovations, and the sustained effort of entire societies devoted to military production. The Bendix chin turret on the B-17G Flying Fortress represents one thread in this vast tapestry, a specific technical solution to a specific tactical problem. Its development and deployment illustrated the institutional capacity to identify problems, develop solutions, and implement improvements under the demanding pressures of total war. The crews who manned these turrets, who flew into defended airspace, knowing the statistical improbability of survival, who watched their friends die and continued flying missions, deserved recognition not for superhuman courage, but for ordinary people meeting extraordinary demands. They operated equipment designed by engineers they never met, manufactured by workers they never knew, based on tactical requirements identified by officers they never spoke with. This vast impersonal system somehow produced personal bonds between crew members who trusted each other with their lives. The chin turret gave those crews a better chance of survival. Not a guarantee, not even necessarily good odds, but better than they would have had without it. In the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, marginal improvements in survivability accumulated into significant effects. The bombardier who shot down a German fighter with his chin turret potentially saved his bomber and his crew. That bomber and crew survived to fly another mission and another, each one contributing incrementally to the strategic objective of defeating Germany's capacity to wage war. 7 decades after the last B-17G completed its final mission, The chin turret exists primarily as a footnote in aviation history. Museum visitors occasionally pause to examine preserved examples, noting the twin barrels and the cramped turret dimensions. Few fully comprehend the desperation that drove its development, the skill required for its effective employment, or the lives it saved through its deterrent effect and destructive capability. The turret served its purpose during a specific historical moment when bomber crews needed every possible advantage to survive in hostile skies. It proved adequate to that purpose, neither miracle weapon nor useless appendage, but functional hardware that improved combat effectiveness measurably. The men who operated these turrets have mostly passed away now, taking with them the direct experience of what it meant to watch enemy fighters approach through a plexiglass nose at 600 miles per hour. Combined closure rate, the mechanical turrets that provided them some measure of protection and agency, have largely been reduced to scrap metal or museum displays. What remains is the historical record, the documentation of a tactical problem identified and partially solved through the application of engineering skill and industrial capacity. The Bendix chin turret on the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress stands as testament to an era when such problems could still be addressed through mechanical solutions and human courage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.